If you stand in the courtyard of the Great Mosque in Mecca during the zenith of the afternoon, you do not hear the silence of the desert. Instead, you are enveloped by a pervasive mechanical hiss. It is the sound of 500 high-pressure mist fans mounted on gray pillars, blasting millions of gallons of chilled water into the air. This is not merely air conditioning, it is a calculated atmospheric intervention. As the mist settles on the skin of the pilgrims, it evaporates instantly, cheating the thermodynamics of the Arabian Peninsula and lowering the ambient temperature by 6 degrees Celsius. For the millions circling the Kaaba, this artificial breeze is a mercy. But if you look higher, beyond the minarets and into the stratosphere, a far more radical intervention is taking place. High above the holy sites, unmarked aircraft authorized by the Saudi Regional Cloud-seeding Program are patrolling the cloud layer. Their payload is silver iodide, a chemical compound with a crystalline structure nearly identical to ice. When injected into moisture-heavy clouds, these particles act as nuclei, tricking water vapor into freezing, growing heavy, and falling as rain. This is the modern reality of the Hajj, a pilgrimage where the sky itself is no longer a sovereign domain of the divine, but a variable to be managed, tweaked, and engineered. We are witnessing the dawn of the terraformed ritual. To understand the magnitude of this shift, we must look back at what the Hajj used to be. For 14 centuries, the Hajj was defined by its relationship to the lethal environment of the Hijaz. The word Hajj implies a journey, but the experience was often one of survival. Historical chronicles are filled with accounts of ishar, a specific jurisprudential state of being prevented from completing the rites. Traditionally, ishar was caused by enemies, bandits, or illness, but frequently the preventative force was nature itself. Blinding sandstorms, impassable floods, or heat so ferocious it killed camels in their tracks. In the classical view, nature was an obstacle placed by God, and the pilgrim's vulnerability to it was part of the submission. The heat of Mecca was once the great leveler, stripping the king and the pauper alike of their comfort. Now, as the cool mist descends and the clouds are milked for rain, the physical trial is receding. We have entered an era where the climate is just another piece of infrastructure, maintained and optimized like the lighting or the paving stones. The pilgrim walks in a bubble of safety, protected from the very sky that Abraham stood under. The desert has never been a place of comfort. It is a place of revelation. Throughout the history of Abrahamic faith, the wilderness was sought specifically because it was hostile. It was in the barrenness that the voice of the divine could be heard most clearly, unmuted by the distractions of ease. This intuition is codified in Islamic theology under the concept of Mashaqqa, the doctrine of merit through hardship. There is a famous hadith, often cited by classical scholars, where the Prophet Muhammad tells his wife Aisha that her reward in the Hajj is directly proportional to her fatigue and effort. For centuries, this equation was the bedrock of the pilgrim's mindset. The greater the suffering, the greater the purification. We can see this logic burning through the pages of medieval travelogues. When the Andalusian poet and scholar Ibn Jubair performed his Hajj in the 12th century, he did not write about the heat as an inconvenience to be solved. He described the scorching winds and the thirst as a fire that burned away sins, just as fire refines gold. The brutality of the elements was essential to the liturgy. To walk until your feet bled, to sweat until you were faint, this was the somatic price of entering the sacred precinct. The suffering was not an accident, it was the currency of devotion. In the Sufi tradition, the burning of the self in the physical world was a mirror of the burning of the ego in the spiritual realm. To remove the heat would be like removing the fasting from Ramadan. It would hollow out the discipline. However, theology is not static, and neither is the consensus of the ulama. As the technological capacity to cool the holy sites emerged, a powerful counter-narrative began to take hold, rooted in two other Islamic legal maxims: taysir, meaning facilitation or ease, and Hifz al-Nafs, the preservation of life. The 20th and 21st centuries brought a population explosion to the Hajj that the ancients could never have imagined. With millions of bodies packed into narrow valleys, the heat transformed from a spiritual test into a mass killer. Tragedies involving heat stroke and stampedes forced a reevaluation of the merit of hardship. Modern jurists and scholars have largely pivoted away from the romanticization of suffering. They argue that the Hajj is a ritual of presence and memory, not a torture test. If a pilgrim faints from heat exhaustion, they cannot perform the rites with presence of heart, or khushu. Therefore, the engineering of cool air is reframed not as a luxury that dilutes the spirit, but as a religious duty of stewardship. The argument is compelling. God desires ease for the believer, not destruction. By using technology to save lives, the state is fulfilling the higher objective of the Sharia, the protection of the human soul. Yet this shift creates a friction that is hard to ignore. We are replacing the involuntary hardship of the past with a voluntary, curated comfort. The tension lies between the history of the prophets, who walked through fire and famine, and the modern pilgrim who walks through a mist-cooled corridor. We have accepted that dying of heat stroke is not a pious act, but a failure of planning. In doing so, we have fundamentally changed the texture of the ritual. The struggle is no longer against the raw, crushing power of nature, but against the internal distractions of a comfortable body. The theology has successfully adapted to the technology, justifying the air conditioning as mercy, but the ghost of the old, punishing desert still haunts the edges of the conversation, asking if something visceral has been lost in the cooling. The mist fans and cloud seeding are only the prologue. The vision for the future of Mecca is a project of total environmental design, often referred to as the Green Mecca Initiative. The blueprints for the coming decades read less like religious architecture and more like planetary engineering. Plans are already in motion to coat the walkways of the holy sites with heat-reflective nanomaterials that bounce solar radiation back into space, keeping the ground cool to the touch even when air temperatures soar above 40 degrees. AI-driven weather modeling systems are being integrated to predict micro-patterns of heat and humidity, adjusting the climate control systems in real time before a pilgrim even begins to sweat. This is the era of the smart Hajj, where the environment is made submissive to the needs of the visitor. But this technological dominance introduces a deep philosophical irony. The core literal meaning of the word Islam is submission, specifically submission to the will of God, which has traditionally included submission to the natural reality God created. When we terraform the sacred precincts, we are inverting this relationship. We are no longer submitting to the environment, we are bending it to our will. The desert, once a sovereign force that demanded respect and fear, is being tamed into a backdrop, a scenic wallpaper for the ritual rather than a participant in it. This dynamic is not unique to Islam. It mirrors a global trend in modern spirituality, which sociologists call the sanitization of the sacred. We see parallels in the air-conditioned gospel debates within American evangelicalism, where the comfort of the megachurch auditorium was criticized for softening the hard edges of the faith. Across traditions, there is a modern impulse to remove the friction from religious experience, to make it accessible, safe, and efficient. We treat physical discomfort as a distraction from spiritual focus, whereas the ancients treated it as the catalyst for spiritual focus. The danger of the Green Mecca is not that it is comfortable, but that it is silent. The desert was the cradle of monotheism because it was loud with the reality of death and survival. It forced the human being to recognize their smallness. As we pave over the sand with cooling tiles and fill the sky with artificial rain, we are building a sanctuary that centers human comfort above all else. We are saving the body of the pilgrim, an undeniable good and a moral imperative, but we may be silencing the geography that once spoke to the prophets. The Hajj of the future will be safer, cooler, and more efficient than ever before. Pilgrims will be able to focus on their prayers without the distraction of impending collapse. But as they walk through the climate-controlled colonnades, shielded from the sun and the thirst, they will be walking through a different kind of world than the one Abraham built. The ritual remains, but the stage has changed. We have conquered the heat, but in the cool air of the new Mecca, we must ask if we have also cooled the fervor that comes from needing God for survival. The water no longer comes from a miraculous spring in the sand. It comes from a misting nozzle scheduled by an algorithm, perfect and predictable. And in that predictability, the ancient, wild mystery of the desert fades just a little further into history.